a United States Army captain arrived at the 1st Australian Task Force headquarters at Nui Dat in early 1967 with a briefing folder, a pressed uniform, and the quiet confidence of a man who assumed he had something useful to teach. He had been sent from Long Bin as a liaison officer, part of the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam's ongoing effort to maintain coordination between Allied forces. He had served with American infantry in the Central Highlands. He knew jungle warfare. He knew how patrols were run, how contacts were initiated, how the enemy was found and engaged. He sat down across a map table from his Australian counterpart, and before he could open his folder, the Australian officer leaned across, tapped the map of Phuoc Tuy province with 2 fingers, and said something the American had not expected to hear from an ally. "Don't try to keep up with our patrols. We've already had this problem." Wait, what? A warning? Not from an enemy. From an ally? An Australian captain, sitting in a base the size of a small suburb with perhaps 4,000 soldiers in the entire province, was looking at a representative of the largest military machine in the free world, and telling him, in polite but unambiguous terms, that American officers assigned to coordinate with the Australians had already tried to shadow Australian patrol operations in Phuoc Tuy province, and that it had not gone well. Oh, this story gets so much stranger and so much more revealing than you think. Because what the Australians had built in Phuoc Tuy province by 1967 was not just a military base, it was a completely different kind of war. A war of silence, patience, and predatory precision so far removed from American operational culture that United States advisors and liaison officers arriving in the province were quietly, formally, and officially warned not to compete with the Australians on patrol. The advisory existed. The problem it described was real. And the gap in capability it revealed between the 2 armies fighting side by side was so significant that it would become, in the decades after the war ended, one of the most studied tactical contrasts of the entire conflict. Historian Albert Palazzo comments that when the Australians entered the Vietnam War, it was with their own well-considered concept of war, and this was often contradictory or in conflict with U.S. concepts. But what most histories fail to capture is exactly how that contradiction felt on the ground, at the platoon level, at the patrol level. When an American officer walked into the jungle with Australians and discovered that every assumption he carried about how infantry operated in Southeast Asia was wrong, not because the Americans were bad soldiers, but because they had trained for a different kind of war. And this is the story of what happened when those 2 worlds collided in the rubber plantations and dense jungle of Phuoc Tuy province, told through the patrol methods that made the Australians the most feared infantry force in their sector, and the formal U.S. advisory that acknowledged, in the language of military bureaucracy, that there were things the Australians could do in that jungle that Americans simply could not follow. To understand the advisory, you need to understand what Phuoc Tuy province actually was before the Australians arrived. By 1966, when Australian troops moved into Phuoc Tuy province, the area was controlled by the Viet Cong. Not contested, not partially governed, controlled. The provincial capital at Ba Ria was nominally under South Vietnamese government authority, but the roads, the villages, the jungle, and the mountains belonged to the enemy. Operating in Phuoc Tuy, Bien Hoa, and Long Con provinces, the Communist forces comprised both South Vietnamese Viet Cong guerrillas and North Vietnamese People's Army units. Given the task of isolating the eastern provinces from Saigon, by interdicting the main roads and highways, the enemy proved a major challenge to Army of the Republic of Vietnam units that ventured into the province, demonstrating a capacity to mount regimental-size ambushes. The 445th Battalion, known as D-445, the Bay Area Battalion, was a local force battalion of the Viet Cong that operated in the Dong Nai River Basin and also in Bien Hoa, Phuoc Tuy, and Long Can provinces. It had been fighting in this territory for years before any Allied soldier set foot there. It knew every trail, every stream crossing, every village sympathizer, every escape route through the long high mountains and the Mae Tao complex. The population of Phuoc Tuy province had been living under Viet Cong governance for so long that South Vietnamese government control was, in many areas, a theoretical concept rather than a practical reality. Into this environment, in April through June of 1966, came the first Australian task force. 1 ATF was based in a rubber plantation at Nui Dat, 8 kilometers north of Ba Ria in Phuoc Tuy province, and consisted of 2 and later 3 infantry battalions with armor, aviation, engineers, and artillery support. The position they chose for their main base was itself an act of tactical philosophy. Its location ensured that if the Viet Cong wanted to get to the rest of the populace, they would first have to pass through the Australian position. They were not building a fortress to shelter in. They were building an obstacle that forced the enemy to confront them, and around that obstacle they intended to patrol with a ferocity and patience that the Viet Cong, accustomed to facing South Vietnamese units that sat in defensive positions, had never encountered before. Patrolling was the cornerstone of 1 ATF's operations in Phuoc Tuy province. Rather than wait behind the wire for the Viet Cong to launch attacks on the task force base, the Australians sought to control the area around Nui Dat, denying the Viet Cong any element of surprise and making it difficult for them to move undetected. The Australian tactics surprised the Viet Cong, who were used to meeting a South Vietnamese enemy that fought from defensive positions and rarely pursued them into the jungle. That phrase, rarely pursued them into the jungle, is worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains almost everything about what made the Australian approach different and why American officers watching it from the outside couldn't always understand what they were seeing. The Viet Cong's entire operational concept was built around the assumption that if you could survive contact, if you could break contact and melt back into the jungle, you had effectively won. You preserved your force. You preserved your infrastructure. You could fight again tomorrow and next week and next month, and eventually the foreign soldiers would go home. It had worked against the French. It worked against American forces who conducted large sweep operations, made contact, called in firepower, and then returned to their bases. The jungle would absorb you again the moment the helicopters lifted off. The Australians didn't leave. And then came the patrols. While it is commonly held that United States forces sought to draw the enemy into battle and defeat them with overwhelming firepower, Australian forces took a different approach. Australian counterinsurgency tactics demanded constant patrolling, the laying of ambushes, and pursuit of the enemy. Army units would spend long periods patrolling, painstakingly seeking signs of the enemy. Following enemy contact, combat was often at close range and of relatively short duration. The distinction between Australian and American patrol philosophy was not a matter of courage or aggression. Both armies had those qualities in abundance. The distinction was about method, about pace, and about what you considered the purpose of a patrol to be. Whereas the Americans relied on massed firepower and mobility in big unit search and destroy operations as part of a war of attrition which often resulted in heavy casualties on both sides, the Australians emphasized deliberate patrolling using dispersed companies supported by artillery, armored personnel carriers, and helicopters to separate the Viet Cong from the population in the villages, while slowly extending government control. An American patrol in Vietnam was typically a company or platoon-sized element that moved through terrain at a pace designed to cover ground. It announced its presence not through carelessness, but through sheer size, boots cracking dry leaf litter, radio handsets hissing, the metallic sounds of equipment. American soldiers were professional, disciplined, and brave, but the scale of American operations meant that noise was inevitable and the Viet Cong could hear them coming. One Viet Cong commander later told a journalist, "U.S. troops not hard to see, not hard to fight. Much noise, much equipment, big columns, nice green uniforms." An Australian patrol was something else entirely. Journalist Gerald Stone described tactics being used by Australian soldiers in 1966. The Australian battalion has been described as the safest combat force in Vietnam. It is widely felt that the Australians have shown themselves able to give chase to the guerrillas without exposing themselves to the lethal ambushes that have claimed so many American dead. Australian patrols shun jungle tracks and clearings, picking their way carefully and quietly through bamboo thickets and tangled foliage. It is a frustrating experience to trek through the jungle with Australians. Patrols have taken as much as 9 hours to sweep a mile of terrain. 9 hours, 1 mile. Think about that in terms of what it required from every soldier in that patrol. It required an almost meditative state of awareness, hands moving branches aside rather than pushing through them, feet placed with deliberate care to avoid snapping vegetation, a hand signal language fluent enough to communicate complex tactical information without a whisper, weight distributed so that no footfall crunched unexpectedly, eyes constantly reading not just the terrain directly ahead, but the indicators of human presence, the broken twig at waist height, the slight depression where a boot had pressed, the way birds moved or fell silent. This wasn't hiking slowly. This was hunting, and the Australians had been trained to do it since before most of them had ever heard of Vietnam. The foundation of that training was the Jungle Warfare Training Center at Canungra, Queensland. During the Vietnam War, the Jungle Training Center at Canungra became the major training venue for the Army as it prepared units for active service in Southeast Asia. Following the commitment of Australian personnel to South Vietnam, the center ramped up its training program as 10,000 soldiers were rotated through Canungra each year as part of the pre-deployment training each battalion had to complete before undertaking its tour of duty. Canungra wasn't new to this mission. It was originally established during World War II as the Jungle Training Center to prepare troops for combat in the Southwest Pacific area. The institutional knowledge that had been developed fighting the Japanese in the impossibly dense terrain of New Guinea had been carried forward, refined through the Malayan emergency, tested again in Borneo, and by the mid-1960s embedded into a training doctrine that was unlike anything American soldiers received. Australia's proficiency in jungle warfare did not begin in Vietnam. It was forged through the experiences of World War II in the Pacific and the post-war operations in places such as the Malayan emergency. Senior Australian officers recognized that the very nature of jungle and counterinsurgency warfare demanded tactics quite different from the open terrain, combined arms doctrine of Europe. This was the institutional memory that Kanungra transmitted, not just the physical skills of jungle movement, but the cultural understanding that in this environment, patience was a weapon, silence was a weapon, and the willingness to move slower than any enemy expected was the tactical advantage that made everything else possible. One Australian captain noted, "You Americans train for 5 or 6 different types of warfare. In Australia, we train only for jungle warfare," noting that the Australian Jungle Warfare Centre at Kanungra, Queensland, produced the kind of aggressive tactics that worked so well in Vietnam. That single sentence is perhaps the most concise explanation of the gap that American liaison officers encountered when they arrived in Phuoc Tuy province and tried to accompany Australian patrols. The Americans had trained for multiple environments, multiple threats, multiple operational contexts. That breadth was a strength in global strategic terms. In the specific context of patrolling jungle terrain against an enemy who had been fighting in those exact conditions for decades, it was a liability. The Australians had refined one thing to a standard of excellence that simply could not be replicated by a force whose training was broader and less specialized. The patrol methods that emerged from that training produced contacts at ranges that American officers found extraordinary. Overwhelmingly, ranges of engagement were less than 50 meters across each form of contact. More than half of all ambushes were at ranges of just 15 meters or less. Nearly 80% of all contacts were at ranges of 30 meters or less. These were not statistics from a force getting caught at close range. These were statistics from a force deliberately operating at close range, moving so silently that they could get within 15 meters of the enemy before initiating contact, which meant they chose the moment and the terms of every engagement. The enemy sought to reduce his vulnerability to 1 ATF heavy weapons, especially indirect fire support and close air support, by using the concealment provided by dense jungle or night. Range of engagement in the jungle was determined by the range of visibility, which was often as short as 3 to 5 meters. In terrain where you couldn't see more than 3 meters, the Australians were still moving, still navigating, still maintaining tactical integrity as a patrol unit. The training to operate at that standard was what an American officer couldn't replicate by reading a manual or attending a brief orientation. To bring the enemy to battle, 1 ATF conducted an intensive patrolling and ambushing effort, and when enemy camps or bunker systems were located, these were attacked. This emphasis on patrolling and ambushing is reflected in the contacts data. Together, patrol encounters and ambushes represented 70% of all 1 ATF contacts. At the elite end of Australian operations in Phuoc Tuy province, the Special Air Service Regiment operated at a level that put the gap between Australian and American capability into sharpest relief. Even though Australians had been in Vietnam since 1962, the Australian Special Air Service Regiment first arrived in Vietnam in April 1966 with the mission of conducting long-range reconnaissance patrols in the dense Vietnamese jungles. Small fire teams of 4 to 6 men moved much more slowly than any other unit, even other special operations units. But once in contact with the enemy, the Australians unleashed a barrage of fire designed to make the enemy believe there were more men on the opposing side than there really were. The slow, quiet movement and hellish raking fire the Australians brought to the NVA and Viet Cong made them the most feared enemy unit in the areas of South Vietnam. In several communist military histories, Australian regular infantry battalion elements are often referred to as Biet Keach, meaning commandos, together with Special Air Service Regiment troops, noting that the Australian infantry routinely operated in section and half-platoon-sized patrols. The NVA and Viet Cong considered the Australian infantry to be elite commandos, as compared to U.S. forces that appeared to operate in larger units. Special Air Service Regiment troops were also reportedly called Ma Rung by the NVA and Viet Cong, phantoms or ghosts of the jungle. The SAS achieved results during their Vietnam deployment that remain extraordinary by any measure. By the end of their time in Vietnam, the unit performed 1,200 combat patrols with 1 killed in action, 1 dead from wounds, 3 accidentally killed, 1 missing, and 1 death from illness. Before their departure in 1971, the Australian SASR achieved a remarkable milestone by eliminating 600 enemy troops, establishing the highest kill ratio of the entire war. 1,200 patrols, 1 killed in action. Those numbers are not a testament to the Australians avoiding contact. They are a testament to the Australians controlling contact, to initiating engagements on their terms, in their time, from positions the enemy didn't know existed until the firing started. Members of the Australian Army Special Air Service operated 5-man patrols in South Vietnam. A patrol would silently move toward a Vietnamese camp, recording relevant information and relaying that information via radio back to base. The nucleus of SAS operations was the 5-man patrol, which lasted an average of 10 days. An ambush would only be attempted at the conclusion of a patrol, and then only if practical. Intelligence gathering was always the main goal of an SAS patrol. The discipline required to sit in observation positions for days, watching enemy activity, recording patterns, building intelligence pictures without moving, without eating hot food, without speaking above a breath, without being detected by an enemy that was actively patrolling its own territory. That was the standard the SAS maintained, and it was a standard that American liaison officers observing their operations found genuinely difficult to comprehend as a practical military capability rather than a theoretical aspiration. They were so effective in the field that the NVA called the Australians the ghosts of the jungle. They even provided instructors to the United States Long-Range Reconnaissance Patrol School. That detail matters enormously. The Australians were not just operating differently. They were recognized as the benchmark by the Americans themselves. American Special Operations reached out to Australian SAS instructors because American long-range reconnaissance patrols, the best patrol units the United States Army deployed to Vietnam, acknowledged there was something in the Australian method they needed to understand. The advisory warning American officers not to compete with the Australians on patrol was not written from a position of Australian arrogance. It was written from a position of documented, observed, repeatedly confirmed reality. Because when American officers had accompanied Australian patrols without that warning, the results were educational in the most uncomfortable way possible. The problem wasn't physical capability. American soldiers were fit, disciplined, and trained. The problem was the behavioral patterns that American training instilled without the soldiers being aware of them. The instinct, when unsure of your position in dense jungle, to key the radio handset and request a grid check. The habit, developed in American training, of maintaining tighter formation intervals than the Australians used, which paradoxically made Australian patrols easier to command and harder to detect. The unconscious tendency to check your watch more frequently than the Australians considered safe because American patrols operated on tighter time schedules. The way American soldiers positioned their weapons at the ready, which was tactically sound by American standards, but different from the Australian immediate action drill that could produce fire faster from a patrol rest position. Each of these small behavioral differences was, individually, manageable. Together, in terrain where a misplaced boot could end a patrol before it started, they added up to a detection risk the Australians had spent years training to eliminate. The formal advisory warning essentially codified what Australian officers had been telling their American counterparts informally since early 1966. The message was not condescending. It was professional. It acknowledged that the Australians and Americans were doing different things in their sectors, and that the gap in patrolling technique was not a moral failing or a deficiency in courage. It was the product of different training histories, different institutional cultures, and different approaches to what a patrol was designed to accomplish. The 1 ATF light infantry tactics, such as patrolling, searching villages without destroying them, with a view to eventually converting them, and ambush and counter-ambush, drew criticism from some U.S. commanders. General William Westmoreland is reported to have complained to Major General Tim Vincent that 1 ATF was not being aggressive enough. That complaint reveals the core of the misunderstanding. Westmoreland was measuring aggression by the metric his doctrine used: enemy killed, ground swept, operations mounted. The Australians were measuring success by a completely different standard. Unlike the American strategy of attrition, which defined no strategic objectives beyond killing large numbers of enemy, 1 ATF strategy was to disrupt the enemy system of food supply. 1 ATF sent its patrols against the enemy lines of communication and the numerous enemy bunker systems and base camps where most of the enemy's large food reserves were to be found. 1 ATF units captured over 1,800 bunker systems and base camps. The average amount of food captured per bunker system and base camp declined each year to almost nothing by 1970. That last figure tells you everything. By 1970, the Australians were finding empty bunkers because the Viet Cong had stopped using them to store food in the Australian sector, not because the enemy had stopped eating, because the constant, relentless, patient patrolling had made the risk of storing supplies in places the Australians could find them too high to accept. The Australians had not killed their way to this outcome. They had patrolled their way to it. They had made Phuoc Thai Province a place where the enemy could not predict its own safety, could not establish logistics infrastructure, could not move freely enough to sustain long-term operations. The Viet Cong and NVA generally sought to avoid contact with 1 ATF patrols unless under circumstances favorable to themselves. Their main force units withdrew into the jungle where they used wide dispersal, a marked preference to break contact and withdraw if confronted by a 1 ATF patrol, and the construction of bunker systems providing good protection against indirect fire as their main force protection measures. Except for these relatively rare occasions, the burden of maneuver to get into contact fell upon 1 ATF. The Viet Cong preferred to avoid the Australians. Think about what that means for a guerrilla force. The fundamental operational principle of guerrilla warfare is that you fight when conditions are favorable and you avoid battle when they're not. The Viet Cong applied this principle with discipline and success against American forces, choosing when and where to engage, fading away when American firepower built up. But in Phuoc Tuy Province, The calculation that had to be made was not about whether to engage, but about whether any movement was safe at all, because the Australians were always there. They were always in the jungle, and you could never know where. Australian units were quiet hunters, patient, thorough, always on the lookout for opportunities to outthink the local Viet Cong. In Buoc Tui province, Australian units operated at night, and, as one Australian officer put it, under our system, we do the lurking. We do the lurking. 4 words that summarize an entire tactical philosophy. In most armies, the guerrilla lurks. The conventional force searches, sweeps, establishes, and secures. The guerrilla is the predator, and the regular infantry is the prey that doesn't know where the next ambush is coming from. The Australians inverted this. In Phuoc Tui province, it was the Viet Cong who found itself hunted by an enemy that moved more quietly, waited more patiently, and struck more precisely than anything it had faced before. The Communist East Zone Command issued orders forbidding its units from ambushing Australian units without permission. That order is the clearest possible indication of how dramatically the Australians had changed the psychological dynamic in their sector. The Viet Cong, a force that defined itself through its ability to conduct ambushes, was so shaken by Australian patrol aggression that its command structure felt compelled to issue formal restrictions on when its own forces could engage. The hunters had become the hunted, and the command structure was managing its troops' fear. The 1ATF also built a jungle warfare training center in Phuoc Tui province itself. As the Australians, New Zealanders, and Americans prepared to withdraw, the AATTV established a jungle training center in Phuoc Tui province. The institutional knowledge wasn't just being applied to operations, it was being codified, taught, passed on. In the middle of an active combat zone, the Australians were running a school. For South Vietnamese forces, for Allied advisors, for anyone the Australian commanders believed could absorb the lessons. This wasn't a small symbolic gesture. It was a statement that the Australian approach to counterinsurgency in jungle terrain was transferable doctrine, not a cultural accident. The broader picture of how this played out operationally is visible in the campaign record of the D445 Battalion across the years of Australian presence. Until 1971, D445 Battalion would fight mainly with the Australian and New Zealand forces operating in Phuoc Tui province from their base at Nui Dat. The battalion that had dominated the province before the Australians arrived found itself in a sustained 5-year attrition that it could not reverse. A major loss to the battalion was the discovery and destruction of the Mae Tau Mountain Base in December 1969, including the battalion's field hospital and pharmacy. The loss of a field hospital and pharmacy in the middle of combat operations is not a logistical inconvenience. It is a catastrophe for a guerrilla force that has no other means of treating its wounded. It meant Viet Cong soldiers who survived firefights were now dying from wounds that could not be treated. It degraded morale in ways that no propaganda could counteract. And it happened because Australian intelligence operations, built on patient patrol-derived intelligence rather than signals, intercepts, or prisoner interrogations, had mapped the enemy's rear area logistics so thoroughly that facilities the enemy considered hidden were found and destroyed. The 1st Australian Task Force, based at Nui Dat, had secured central Phuoc Tui through aggressive patrolling and cordon and search operations, achieving kill ratios exceeding 10-to-1 in prior engagements and rendering main roads safer. Kill ratios exceeding 10-to-1. In a conflict where American forces were routinely criticized for unsustainable casualty exchanges that neither broke enemy will nor secured the population, the Australians were producing tactical outcomes that exceeded almost anything comparable elsewhere in Vietnam, and they were producing them not through superior firepower or numerical advantage, but through superior patrolling. The New Zealanders integrated into this system deserve specific acknowledgement, because the ANZAC partnership in Phuoc Tui province was not merely political symbolism. New Zealand infantry units were deployed in 1967 and, after March 1968, were integrated into Australian battalions serving with 1 ATF. The combined infantry forces were thereafter designated ANZAC battalions. The New Zealanders brought their own jungle warfare heritage, their own institutional training, and their own professional standards to the partnership. The 6th RAR-NZ ANZAC Battalion, during Operation Laverack, placed all 5 rifle companies on enemy routes, positioning a fire support patrol base in the center of the area of operations, where it could provide artillery fire support over the whole area. A major contribution to these military successes was the spectacularly effective tactical positioning of the 5 rifle companies on all enemy routes throughout western and northern Phuoc Tui province. Though this broad spread of rifle companies minimized mutual support, it resulted in an unusually large number of contacts with Viet Cong and demonstrated that the advantages of a numerically superior enemy over isolated rifle companies could be neutralized by effective, timely fire support. The ANZAC battalions conducting this kind of dispersed, aggressive operation across the full width of a provincial area were doing something American doctrine couldn't replicate at equivalent force ratios. The Australians and New Zealanders were confident enough in their individual small unit capability, in the ability of a section or platoon to manage contact in isolation and bring in fire support effectively, to spread across distances that would have seemed dangerously overextended to American commanders. While U.S. forces fought a war characterized by big battles, 1 ATF was allocated an area of operations in Phuoc Tui province where, apart from a small number of major battles, the war took the form of a protracted counterinsurgency campaign against the National Liberation Front and the People's Army of Vietnam. Australian units operating continuously in one province developed local expertise in terrain, Vietnamese tribal and village dynamics, enemy infiltration routes, and the interplay between population, insurgency, and jungle base areas. This long-term presence contrasted with the U.S. tendency to rotate large units frequently. This is perhaps the most underappreciated element of Australian effectiveness. American units in Vietnam typically rotated in and out of operational areas as their tour cycles required. A battalion might be in one province for months, then transferred elsewhere, its hard-won knowledge of local terrain, enemy patterns, and population dynamics leaving with it. The Australians stayed in Phuoc Tui. Year after year, the task force was in the same province, building an intelligence picture that grew more detailed and more actionable with every patrol that went out. The formal advisory warning not to compete with Australian patrols was, in one sense, simply an honest acknowledgement of a capability gap, but in another sense, it was a symptom of the deeper structural tension that ran through the entire Australian-American relationship in Vietnam. U.S. forces sought to flush out the enemy and achieve rapid and decisive victory through brazen scrub bashing and the use of massive firepower. Australians acknowledged they had much to learn from the U.S. forces about heliborne assault and joint armor and infantry assaults. Yet the U.S. measure of success, the body count, was apparently held in contempt by many 1ATF battalion commanders. That contempt was professional, not personal. The 1ATF commanders who rejected the body count metric were not suggesting that killing the enemy was unimportant. They were rejecting it as the primary measure of operational effectiveness because it distorted the behavior of the force that used it. If your success is measured by how many enemy you kill, you optimize your operations for killing. You conduct large sweep operations that announce your presence and drive the enemy to ground, then call in artillery and airstrikes on areas where you suspect enemy forces are hiding. You generate impressively large numbers on a daily statistical report, and you make no lasting progress whatsoever because the enemy has simply relocated and will return once your forces have moved on. The Australians emphasized pre-contact routines, immediate action drills for jungle contact, patrolling techniques over days rather than hours. The patrol culture the advisory was protecting had been built over years of careful development and was genuinely irreplaceable. Comprehensive training programs based on real battlefield experiences and constantly updated to reflect the latest tactical developments made Australian soldiers some of the best prepared jungle fighters of the war. You couldn't import that by attaching American officers to Australian patrols and expecting them to absorb the capability through exposure. The roots went too deep. The habits had been formed too early. The jungle warfare methods practiced by the AATTV emphasized patrolling and contact drills, which taught soldiers to react automatically in battle with the aim of providing them with an advantage over an enemy which was reliant on command, automatic, unreflective, below the level of conscious decision. That was the standard the Australians had trained to, and it was a standard that required not a briefing or an orientation, but years of physical and psychological conditioning. The contrast played out with brutal clarity in episodes where Australian and American forces operated side by side under stress. At the Battle of Long Tan in August 1966, just 2 months after the task force established itself at Nui Dat, the difference in what Australian training produced was on vivid display. The battle occurred on the afternoon of August 18, 1966. While searching a rubber plantation near Long Tan for Communist forces who had attacked the base with mortar and rocket fire, D Company, 6th Battalion, the Royal Australian Regiment, encountered a combined force of North Vietnamese Army regulars and local and provincial forces of the National Liberation Front. D Company numbered 108 men, with an artillery forward observation team comprising New Zealand artillerymen. The combined enemy force, estimated at over 2,000 soldiers, comprised the local Viet Cong D 445 Battalion, reinforced with North Vietnamese soldiers and elements of the main force 275 Viet Cong Regiment, 108 against more than 2,000, in a monsoon rainstorm, in a rubber plantation that the enemy had chosen and prepared. On the following day, 245 enemy bodies were counted on the battlefield, although the enemy is believed to have retrieved many more dead and wounded during the night and removed them from the site of the battle. Australian losses were 17 dead and 25 wounded, one of whom later died of his wounds. Although challenged at the time and since in communist Vietnamese accounts, the victory effectively imposed the Australians' dominance in Phuoc Tuy Province for the duration of their presence there. Australian veterans and historians in the main claim that at Long Tan D 445 Battalion suffered heavy casualties, with captured personnel reportedly later stating the D 445 Battalion's casualties had been 70 killed and 100 wounded, or approximately 50% of its strength. 50% casualties. From a unit of 108 men who had stumbled into a prepared position occupied by 10 times their number. The Australians won that engagement not because they had more firepower than the enemy, though the New Zealand artillery performed magnificently, but because their training had prepared them to fight at close range, under extreme pressure, making rapid, independent decisions at the section and platoon level without waiting for orders that the tactical situation wouldn't allow time to receive. The Battle of Long Ten validated, at the cost of 17 Australian lives, everything the training system at Canungra had been trying to produce. And it sent a message through the Viet Cong command structure in Phuoc Tuy province that would echo through every subsequent calculation they made about engaging the Australians. You could not predict what an Australian patrol would do in contact. You could not assume that numerical superiority would produce the panicked withdrawal it produced against other forces. You could not count on the Australians to break when they were outnumbered, because they had been trained specifically to hold, to fight, to call in fire, and to go on the offensive at the moment you least expected it. This is the context in which the advisory warning must be understood. It wasn't simply about keeping American officers from being embarrassed by not being able to keep up with Australian patrol pace. It was about protecting an operational ecosystem that had taken years to build and that could be compromised by introducing elements that didn't belong to it. Australian patrol security, the absolute silence and deliberate movement that made it possible to operate within meters of the enemy undetected, depended on every member of a patrol operating at the same standard. One person operating at a different standard, making different sounds, moving at different speeds, positioned differently relative to cover, was an asymmetry that a skilled enemy could detect. An American officer on an Australian patrol, however well-intentioned, however professional, was a variable that the patrol commander could not fully control because that officer's instincts had been formed in a different training environment. Following a sustained effort by 1 ATF in Phuoc Tuy province between September 1969 and April 1970, the bulk of PAVN and Viet Cong forces had become inactive and had left the province to recuperate. Accordingly, the Australians shifted focus, turning their attention to denying the Viet Cong the chance to resupply by close ambushing around villages and towns. By 1970, the operational picture in Phuoc Tuy province had been transformed from what it was in 1966. The province that had been entirely Viet Cong controlled when the Australians arrived was now a province where the enemy's main force units had withdrawn and were struggling to reconstitute. That transformation was the direct product of the patrol methodology the advisory had been written to protect. What the Australians had achieved in Phuoc Tuy province with roughly 8,000 troops at peak strength was, by any measurable standard, more effective counterinsurgency than American forces were achieving with forces many times larger elsewhere in Vietnam. Australia's peak commitment at any one time was 7,672 combat troops and New Zealand's 552 in 1969. 8,000 soldiers in a single province producing results that degraded enemy capability to the point of operational irrelevance through patience, persistence, and the systematic application of a patrol doctrine that the enemy could not defeat and Americans could not replicate without years of preparation. The lesson written into the advisory warning was the lesson the entire Australian-Vietnam experience embodied. There is a category of military capability that cannot be transferred through briefings, embedded advisors, or observational attachments. It can only be transmitted through the same sustained, rigorous training process that produced it. The Australians had built that process over decades, refining it through multiple campaigns in multiple countries, and they had brought it to Phuoc Toi Province in 1966 as the core of everything they intended to do. When the formal advisory was issued, telling American officers not to compete with ANZAC aggression on patrol, it was the United States military machine doing something it found institutionally uncomfortable. It was acknowledging that a much smaller force had developed a capability that exceeded what the larger force could produce, and it was acknowledging it in writing, in the language of official military guidance, because the alternative, allowing American officers to continue accompanying Australian patrols and creating security risks in the process, was operationally unacceptable. Following a sustained effort by 1 ATF in Phuoc Toi Province between September 1969 and April 1970, the bulk of PAVN and Viet Cong forces had become inactive and had left the province to recuperate. When Australian forces began their phased withdrawal in 1971, they left behind a province that bore no resemblance to what they had found in 1966. Government control had been extended. Road security had improved. Enemy main force units had been driven out or destroyed. The infrastructure of Viet Cong governance that had operated openly for years before the Australians arrived had been disrupted and degraded to the point of functional collapse in most areas, and it had been accomplished at casualty rates that were the lowest of any comparable Allied force in Vietnam, achieved not through avoiding contact, but through controlling it. The Australian captain who told that American liaison officer in 1967 not to try to keep up with their patrols was not issuing a challenge. He was offering a professional assessment, delivered without ego and without ceremony, from a soldier whose army had spent years learning exactly one thing to a standard of absolute excellence. Don't compete with us in the jungle. Not because you lack courage, not because you lack ability, but because this particular kind of warfare, this specific combination of patience, silence, and predatory precision, requires something that cannot be improvised, borrowed, or briefed. It requires years, and by the time you've found that out the hard way, out there in the bamboo and wait a while vine where visibility ends at 5 meters and the enemy is somewhere in the green darkness ahead, it's already too late to catch up. The MR Rung, the jungle ghosts of Phuoc Toi Province, had built their reputation one silent patrol at a time, and the formal advisory warning that honored that reputation was, in its own understated way, a testament to what a small professional army could accomplish when it refused to be defined by anyone else's doctrine, anyone else's metrics, or anyone else's idea of what aggression should look like.